Hello and welcome to Perspectives on the Voice of America. I'm Dumyake Mwakaliele. International financial institutions such as the World Bank and the International Monetary Fund have often been criticized for their lending practices in developing countries around the world. CommonWealth nations and other concerned groups are calling on these institutions to reform by adjusting to the current demands of the global economy. Leaders of the 10 CommonWealth countries met in London earlier this year and called for a change in the world's economic system. The leaders focused on how the World Bank provides development funds to poor countries and how the IMF sets conditions for offering its financial support. Both institutions date back to the closing months of World War II, when world leaders met at Bretton Woods, New Hampshire in the US, to map out a new international monetary system. VOA's Paul Ndiho recently sat down with Jonathan Ockenden, a top advisor to the CommonWealth Secretariat. Ockenden explained why the CommonWealth is calling for reforms in international financial institutions.
What the heads of government were dealing with was a whole range of international institutions, including the Bretton Woods institutions. So they were considering what changes they would like to see to the system of institutions, which has grown up since the Second World War and is increasingly felt to be not quite meeting the needs of the world today. So they had three parts to the sorts of reforms, the areas for reform that they wished to see. One was in the UN development system, one was about the governance of the environment, and you're right, the other, and probably the most prominent, was reform to the Bretton Woods institutions. And their essential point was that they found that for their own economies and for the world economy, the Bretton Woods institutions were not quite meeting the needs that they felt that they had. The financial crisis had been an example of that. So was the food and fuel crisis.
A lot of critics have gone after the World Bank and the IMF to say that some of their policies, for instance, the structured adjustment policies that they had for developing countries did not work. Do you agree with that kind of view?
I think that the institutions themselves will acknowledge that over a long period mistakes have been made. But I think it's also important to recognise that progress has been made in terms of the way in which the institutions engage with their economies. I was only talking today with the Canadian Executive Director at the IMF, who also services a large number of Caribbean economies, and he was observing the change that had taken place in the IMF's behaviour. I think the point the heads were making in their mini-summit was that whilst these processes are good and the recognition of mistakes is good, they need to go much further.
What is the importance of financial institutions in developing countries? Maybe if you could specifically tie it to African countries. You have about 18 African countries that are members of the Commonwealth.
You're right. We have 18 African countries. A large number of those have gone through the debt relief process, which has involved very close engagement with both of the Bretton Woods institutions. I think the question now is that, having gone through that process, if you like, of clearing the books, where do we go from here? What is the role of the international community in enabling these countries to meet the Millennium Development Goals and achieve the prosperity that both we and their citizens would wish to see?
I'm going to touch briefly about the food prices, the gas prices going up. How is this affecting the global environment?
Well, it's clearly affecting the global environment a great deal. In terms of the Commonwealth itself, because our membership is so diverse, we have all the effects that you can imagine. So there are inflationary effects across the Commonwealth. There are food exporters who can hope to see gains from increased prices over time, but there is a very significant group of small island states in particular, and in Africa, which are badly affected by both rising food and fuel prices. And it's that simultaneous effect which is having quite a bad impact on those countries. Of the 21 countries that the Food and Agriculture Organization identifies as most at risk 8 are Commonwealth countries.
Talk about the upcoming IMF World Bank meetings that are coming up in October, and maybe what would you like to see come out of those meetings?
The primary focus of those meetings is going to be keeping the global economy on track, and that's in the interests of all states, including Commonwealth ones. In terms of the institutions themselves, there are a variety of things that remain interesting, but the focus has now switched from governance reform in the IMF to governance reform in the World Bank. And I think we would be looking in the World Bank to see a rather more ambitious progress on governance, particularly for the poorest and smallest, than we saw in the fund.
And that's it for today. Until tomorrow, I'm Ndiho for the Voice of America.